Hello, today we're taking a look at Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen for a review, or I think it's safe to call it a retrospective at this point, to see how it holds up. But first, let's get the basic details out of the way. Alright, so the game Dragon's Dogma first released in 2012, and then an enhanced version, subtitled The Dark Arisen, came out in 2013. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the differences, as I only played the Dark Arisen version, so let's go with that and the 2013 release date. The game was developed and published by Capcom, who has an extensive library. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but as a refresher, this is the company that made the Monster Hunter, Resident Evil, and Devil May Cry franchises. So without any further build-up, let's get into it to help you answer the most important question asked in this review series. Is this still worth it for you? The beginning of the game will open to a tutorial for the player where they take on the role of a knight named Savin. This tutorial section allows the player to get acquainted with some of the more fundamental aspects of the game while playing out Savin's quest to defeat the dragon. After the tutorial section ends, you enter a character creation menu where you choose your gender, name, build, and voice, and can make some additional customization edits. Character fully customized, the village of Casardis is then attacked by the dragon, and the player who's a resident will join in the defense, before ultimately having their heart taken by the dragon. Contrary to what you would expect, the player character will still be alive after this, but from then on will be known as the Arisen. Without getting too deep into this, it's essentially the title that the protagonist will have, marking them as the one who's destined to face the dragon again later. Shortly after this experience, the player is going to be introduced to pawns. These are essentially going to be followers for the player or party mates, and the player will actually get to create and customize their own pawn to be a permanent follower. After exploring Casardis and eventually heading out, the player will help a group of soldiers in their defense against a Hydra, and then later they're going to escort the head of the Hydra, along with Mercedes, who is one of the soldiers that they helped, to the capital city. And this is what's actually going to kick off the game proper, as it leads the player into being introduced to Duke Edmund, and they begin to take on quests which will all lead to eventual confrontation with the dragon. The entire game basically just focuses on that, with the character questing and exploring the lands in order to grow stronger, and then to eventually have that final showdown with the dragon. Dragon's Dogma is an open-world action RPG set in third person. Core mechanics include a pawn companion system. Essentially, you're going to have 3 pawns with you that act as companions and fill out your party. You're going to create and customize your own main pawn or permanent follower, and then you hire on an additional 2 pawns which can be swapped out as you play through. Interestingly, the pawns that you can hire are actually the main pawns of other players who you borrow into your party for adventuring. If a pawn experiences certain quests, they will gain knowledge of it, and this will be retained when hired on. The action combat system is a hack and slash style with stamina management. We also have the ability to grab and climb onto large monsters, which adds another dimension to combat, and allows players to target those weak points. Stamina is going to be affected by actions such as combat, sprinting, climbing, as well as picking up and carrying some items, and even the weight of all items in your inventory will affect your stamina. The player can also use environmental interaction while in combat, things such as knocking enemies off cliffs or setting oil-soaked enemies on fire, as well as some others. The day-night cycle actually does matter in this game, and the enemy difficulty will spike at night, and the nighttime is very dark, so you actually need to use your lantern. There's not going to be ambient lighting around the player like in some other comparable games, which basically render the light sources superfluous. We have a vocation system built into the game, and you're going to have basic things like fighter, mage, and strider essentially being thief or a stealth class. There's also going to be more advanced hybrid vocations, such as the favorite Mystic Knight, for example, which combines the fighter and mage vocations. The gameplay features a fairly large open-world region of Grancis populated by a few towns, vast wilderness, and some dungeons. There's also going to be a fast travel system which uses fairy stones and port crystals. Basically what this means is you can't just fast travel to any location. First of all, you need to have a specific item which essentially acts as fuel for the fast traveling, and then you can only fast travel to the specific predefined places or a few player chosen locations by leaving an item there. I will mention now that the fuel that you use for fast traveling is essentially useless in the Dark Arisen version, as they give you an eternal version of that item that you can use over and over again. But if you want to have the original mechanic, you could just always opt to never use the eternal version. Many times when you encounter enemies in a location, there's going to be some kind of a boss battle or even a mini boss battle. A lot of times there's going to be some kind of large monster which can be grabbed and climbed onto. The game does have a fairly simple romance mechanic. If you're coming in expecting like BioWare levels, don't. Essentially, if you do things for an NPC and raise their affinity, they'll be chosen to be your beloved at a certain point in the game. If you want to have some control over this, just do a lot of quests and things for the character of your choice. There's also a fairly robust crafting system of combining ingredients to make things like potions or explosives or other things, and you can also purchase or find new equipment and upgrade it at blacksmiths. The game features multiple endings depending on choices made throughout the game, and there is a New Game Plus where you can carry over things to a new playthrough. As far as what to compare to, you could look to just about any open world RPG to get some basic idea. So think things like Witcher 3, maybe with the open world exploration, taking on large monsters and RPG progression. Of course, in Witcher there was no companion system or climbing on monsters. There's also a bunch of other differences, but I would say it's one of the closest open world RPGs with strange monsters roaming around for you to take out. Looking at something like Dragon Age, we do have some surface similarity regarding the companions. However, the differences come up pretty quick. In Dragon Age, the companions are fleshed out and have their own personalities. Dragon's Dogma, by contrast, the companions or pawns are intentionally kind of devoid of any personality or backstory, and essentially just feel like a random NPC follower who travels around with you, rather than having that custom-made actual companions feel on your quest. Another game that I was reminded of was Shadow of the Colossus, mostly just because of the climbing on monsters. I think the way it's done, this is going to be the most similar, but it's still fairly different, as the majority of enemies that you're climbing on in Dragon's Dogma are not colossal in size. So as always, if you have any other suggestions of similar games, please put them down in the comments and discuss so that other gamers can get an idea of what to expect. What sets Dragon's Dogma apart from your other open world RPGs? Well, there's actually quite a few unique aspects to this one. So to begin with, the pawn system is an interesting concept. Being able to create your own permanent follower is definitely a nice addition that allows you to customize your experience. The fact that pawns are mostly empty husks, just a specialized being to aid in combat, but it actually being part of the backstory is kind of interesting. Also, as you recruit the pawns to join you and your permanent follower, the early ones that you hire are going to be low level, and therefore they're going to need to be traded out as you progress, level up, and become stronger. This is going to be frequent early on and likely slow down as you get further into the game, but it does help to keep things feeling fresh. Monster climbing is the other main one. The only game that gave me a similar feeling is the one that I mentioned, Shadow of the Colossus. I've played other games that incorporate something like this, but that was the only one to give the very similar feeling of this mechanic. The day-night cycle actually changes things. Instead of night just being a slightly darker day, night is very dark, and you actually need a lantern in order to find your way around. The world is also going to feel a little bit more hostile at night rather than traveling during the day. So the last thing that I want to mention is the general vibe of the game. So the game is done in a Western medieval fantasy style, but there's going to be an undeniable Japanese vibe to it as well. It really comes across more similar to Western medieval or Western fantasy anime, rather than a standard Western fantasy game developed by a Western dev. As far as bugs, I didn't really run into anything. The game's been out for a long time, so I'm sure there's been lots of patches and things to fix it. I've seen some reports online of pathing issues and quest breaking if you start things at the wrong time, but it's nothing that I ran into, and like I said, it could have been patched out. So as usual, graphics and sound are a little harder to be more objective on. Different people are going to like different things and all that. I would say that for the graphics, there isn't going to be a crazy amount of diversity of environment, but what is there is still holding up quite well in my opinion. Sometimes you do get some weird protagonist expressions during cutscenes, but overall I didn't see this as being a huge issue. The mix of Japanese vibe with the Western fantasy comes out in the graphical style of NPCs and the equipment. As far as the sound, I feel like the voice acting is a full spectrum of good to not great, but really nothing was so jarring as to pull me out of the game. I'm guessing the soundtrack is probably going to be where I'm in the minority. Some of it was pretty decent, but I wasn't a fan of a lot of it, especially the vocalized tracks. Again, this is all up to personal taste though, so use the footage to see if the graphics work for you, and I'll play some examples of the audio so you know what to expect.
Tis far stronger than a common goblin! Goblin!
They come from some unknown place, just appear without a warning. They're a strange lot.
I'll make for the castle directly to offer my report to His Grace. I'll have word sent for you, friend. Pray, sojourn in the capital a while. To the castle main! Step lively!
Fortune smiles upon me. Well met, Sir Arisen. I am called Mesa, if it please you. Now you're come to the capital a conquering hero, you'll be needing aught to do, eh?
So now we're moving away from the objective stuff and into a more subjective take on how I personally felt about the game. If you're new here, don't expect a number rating or something like that because I don't believe in them, but I'll just give a general idea of how I felt about the game and if I enjoyed it or not. Keep in mind that whether or not I liked it doesn't mean that you will or won't, so just use this as a just for fun take on it and use more of the beginning part of the review to decide whether or not this game is right for you. So the big question, did I enjoy Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen?
Yes, I did.
The short and simple answer, yes, I did. So I do tend to enjoy open world RPGs anyway. I would say that I've been liking them less and less over the years, but it definitely used to be my main favorite genre. I feel like this game also has a pretty unique vibe from what I'm used to. I usually tend to prefer the Western style RPG games, but this one sort of blends the Western style with a Japanese undertone to it. That said, as a Western RPG fan, I felt quite at home with this one. So just to talk about a few things that stood out for me, I feel like the armor progression is one of the best that I've ever experienced. So instead of the standard switching out armors every level for the first 5 or 10, and then you end up just sticking with one for the rest of the game, I felt like there was a much more gradual build-up. I personally like games with companions and traveling in a party, and I thought it was neat how you basically get to swap out pawns as you progress through the game, as the pawns you hire earlier on are going to be too low level and weak as you get stronger. So, although I do think it's interesting to build into the game backstory of why pawns are so generic and why they can be swapped out so easily, I tend to prefer when you get to know your companions and there's more of a relationship that's built over time. This is probably going to sound fairly contradictory, and really it is. I like having to swap out the pawns so that I have a fresh experience, but also I like building relationships over time. So what am I even talking about here? So I think something like the Dragon Age style of game where you have companions with unique personalities, but at the same time, they are going to have niche roles, it means that you're going to have to swap them out at specific times. I think that's kind of the sweet spot for me personally. So something that's kind of weird, because this is the Dark Arisen version, when you go to fast travel you're supposed to use a fairy stone which gets used up. In the Dark Arisen version, you're going to have an eternal fairy stone that doesn't get used up, so the entire mechanic is just rendered useless. So like I mentioned, I guess you could just avoid using it and only using the standard fairy stones, but if it's there you're probably going to end up using it. I'm not really sure if this is going to be a problem though, but it might cut down on some of the exploration that you would otherwise engage in. There's also a bunch of other things that you can dive into in this game like crafting and alchemy. Honestly, I didn't really go that deep into it in my playthrough, but it's pretty typical for me. It's just nice to know it's there if it's something that you want to get involved in though. I feel like the beginning of the game was a pretty high difficulty spike, but it tapers off very quickly as well. Once you level up a little bit and get some better equipment, you're going to easily be stomping everything. Maybe if you make really poor choices with progression, you could have a different experience, but I kind of feel like you'd have to be purposely sabotaging yourself. I found the game fairly easy, all things considered. I did do a decent amount of side questing though, so if that's not your thing and you just rush the main quest, you might run into some stumbling blocks. I really appreciated the darker nights. I tend to find in games like, say, the Elder Scrolls for instance, I always need to use mods to make nights actually dark. I really dislike when there's an almost ambient light emanating from the character. Nights should be difficult to navigate in. Also, there should be more monsters and things out there to ambush you. They really did things better in this game than many others in my opinion. So something else that's probably expected is the game is very long, and this could either be good or bad depending on your preferences. But it didn't feel artificially long like some of the modern Assassin's Creed for example. I always felt like I was doing something, working towards completing the main quest or voluntarily exploring areas. Personally, I don't think it seemed to suffer from that modern open world experience of just forcing you to waste a ton of time on pointless nothing. There are some of those instances like escort missions that can feel like it, but honestly I had already explored the areas before needing to escort and I would just use the fast travel system to complete those. There are some quests that can be failed if you don't complete them before continuing on in the main quest. I really don't like this in games, and I'm always wondering which quests are going to be safe and which aren't, but honestly, it's a pretty minor gripe. All in all, I'd say if you're a fan of open world RPGs, especially those set in a medieval fantasy setting, this is going to be a good one to go back and check out. Things have held up pretty well, and it still feels like an overall positive experience. If this is one that you were on the fence, if you should check it out before checking out the sequel, I really do think it's worth it to pick up and play. Regardless, I really hope you enjoyed this look at Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. If you already played through the game, please let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with my own opinion. And if you found the video helpful or entertaining, please give it a like here and also consider subscribing to the channel. I post a bunch of gaming content, not just reviews, and I'd love to have you join the community and help direct the future of the channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today, and until next time, take care.